good time. We have the final panel right now. We will talk about the threat of terrorism and how can we deal successfully with the terrorist threat. And we will give you all the answers which you have missed throughout the day. So we will solve and resolve this situation in the next hour and a half. I'm joined here by 4 distinguished panelists. Let me start right to my left here. That is Bob Jenkins of UNC-Chapel Hill. Bob is an expert on Eastern Europe, in particular on the Slavic world, on Hungary, and many other things which he will tell you about in his contribution. Then here, right to my left, is Peter Eltsov of the National Defense University in Fayetteville. Peter is an expert on Russia, being a Russian non-national, Russian, now Russian-born himself, and he deals with Russian foreign policy. He also has an expertise in Asia, in many parts of Asia. And then to my right is Sara Del Rey. She's from North Carolina State University. Sara is a forensic psychologist and a public health expert, and she will tell us about her side of the story on international terrorism. And last but not least is Professor Dick Kohn. Dick is a retired military historian here at UNC-Chapel Hill, and Dick deals particularly with military-civilian relations in the United States, but his expertise on international affairs is vast, and we will hear about that in a minute. I would suggest, and I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm here at UNC-Chapel Hill as well. I would suggest that each of our panelists will just talk for 10 minutes about how to deal with the terrorist threat, and then maybe I will ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to you. And I would say, because it is the last session, it's getting late and people may want to do other things tonight, that we finish round about 7:30, but if there are many questions, I'm sure we can also, extend it by a few minutes, but not too many minutes. So, may I ask for volunteers, who would like to start? Shall we start with you, Bob?
Okay, very good. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Toby, for organizing a wonderful conference. I'm very impressed by the presentations and the quality of the discussion. I'm not a terrorism expert, as you'll find out shortly, if you didn't already know that. So it's been a great learning experience for me. I'm a political scientist and a sociologist, and I'm going to talk to you about the things I do know, which are ethnic conflict and international intervention, primarily in the Balkans, which is what I've worked on for the last 15 years. Klaus is right, I worked on Hungary, but that was even longer ago, and though I still follow Hungarian politics a bit, I don't do much active research there these days. So I wanted to organize my talk basically around 4 themes, or 3.5 themes, based on what someone who works on ethnic conflict and international intervention sees in terms of the parallels with the response to terrorism. So the first topic is distinguishing among types of terrorist actors. I heard this over the last couple days, and I don't think sufficient analytic distinction has really been made. First, we can identify states. Generally, we don't think of states as terrorist actors, but ISIS would be an exception to that, its attempt to create a state. And then, of course, we heard last night on Professor Hoffman's presentation about state support for terrorism. So the strategies that we might aim towards states would be different than the next category, which is perhaps more what we think of, and certainly is closer to the world that I deal with in many ways, and that's movements and networks. So movements and networks, whether they're well-organized, kind of trans-global, as in al-Qaeda has been, or ISIS as well, though much more regional, or the affiliates of al-Qaeda, they have a different kind of structure and a different kind of action plan, and the response to them would be a little bit different. I'll get to that in a minute. And of course, in addition to the smaller regional affiliates, there might be very much localized, but I would call those the third level, and those are more what I would call local cells, which have more of a domestic orientation. and the response to them will also be a little bit different. So with those distinctions in mind, let me talk about first how I like to teach about ethnic conflict, and that's I use a mobilization approach that basically thinks about three factors that determine ethnic mobilization, and I think there's parallels. I've been trying to encourage some grad students to pick this up for the study of terrorist groups, but no one's taken the bait yet. Perhaps that says something about the model, or perhaps it actually says something about the grad students that work with me. They're more interested in ethnic conflict than they are in terrorism. But the first is a kind of preconditions. When we talk about ethnic preconditions, obviously, you know, ethnicity, nation, they have some kind of persistent mobilization potential. And in this case, I think we would transfer that into the identity issues, for example, that Farah was talking about in the last presentation, the us versus them element, which I'm less convinced we can eliminate that distinction than she is. I think that's a very persistent distinction about identity. But we can transform that distinction and try to mediate that in certain ways. And of course that requires thinking about what the mobilizers do. In an ethnic conflict, they do a lot of activity that the sociologists call framing. That is, they identify targets, they identify bad guys, they identify the good guys, what needs to be done, what kind of goals there are, and all this takes place in a terrorist operation. And what's particularly important, I think, when we think about, in particular, the movements and the networks, as well as the local cells, and then, of course, what I've heard a lot about in the last 2 days is the role of social media and kind of new communication technologies in this, is producing the alternative frame. And I think this is also what Farah was talking about a little bit, is, you know, trying to counter an existing frame that the terrorists, the radicals use for mobilization, and coming up with a different kind of frame in that regard. So that's one kind of element of that, is kind of the preconditions to mobilization, if you will. Second is the opportunity structure. And the opportunity structure in ethnic mobilization has a lot to do with the structuring of power, and in particular with decentralization of power, where it gives ethnic groups an opportunity to mobilize. Now, this is a bit contradictory when it comes to terrorism, because you don't want decentralized power to be replaced with centralized power, because that creates its own set of problems. So I'm not sure how to translate that exactly, but I do know that one of the elements to this is what government policies are. And so we should think about government policies and how they facilitate the mobilization. And of course, in authoritarian regimes, government policies are definitely exclusionary. So thinking about inclusionary policies would be one way to attack opportunity structure for terrorists. Another possible element of that is, of course, thinking about coalitions among groups in society that broaden the political base rather than excluding the terrorists and their potential political base. So I just throw that out there more for discussion and comment. And then the third element of this is the actual mobilization process. And here what we know, this is pretty standard social movements literature, is that, you know, the mobilization of collective action works best when you have dense networks of people. And so this is one of the reasons why, you know, the counterterrorism strategy tries to buy in the Islamic organizations, because those are clearly organizations that are in the community. So, you know, that strategy by itself isn't necessarily bad from this perspective, but of course it depends on the approach, and I think, you know, David highlighted the kind of hollowness of the approach last time, as well as the over-politicization of the approach, for example, as opposed to treating it as an equal partner, perhaps, in constructing a dialogue, or even constructing, you know, this is something that I think we heard in terms of the European approach, or certainly the UK approach, a kind of multicultural approach to dealing with exclusion, right? So you have to change the frame and you have to change the way in which things are organized, but you're still going to be looking for those same basic tools of organization. So those are just some ideas about how mobilization occurs and potential for demobilization. Now, the one problem I see in all of this, from this perspective, is that the radicals have a pretty clear ideology for mobilization and I haven't heard a very clear counter-ideology. And so it's very difficult to mobilize on diffuse ideas and kind of, the multicultural idea itself, while it appeals to liberals, is not a kind of strategy that breeds, close community and mobilization. So it would really take a lot of effort for that. So that's the second broad piece that I wanted to talk about. Then the third is kind of thinking about this in the big picture, and this gets a little bit about at the kind of things that Warren was talking about this morning, or earlier this afternoon, and Bruce. This is kind of thinking about it geopolitically, and what do you do after conflict, right? And basically what I try to look at in post-conflict environment is kind of 5 different types of intervention. And so how would these take place? And of course one of those is diplomatic. That tends to be more oriented toward the actual resolution of the conflict, so kind of peace agreements. But I think Bruce was hinting, Jettleson, for those of you who weren't here, at needing to build regional coalitions of states against terrorist networks. And I think that that's a key strategy. It's really necessary in bringing about peace building in conflict-torn societies. And I think that there's parallels that could be made in the case of fighting terrorism. Humanitarian assistance is another key strategy. I think that this is a key element, and in a way this is partly what Farah was talking about in terms of the US aid mandate to build economic and social development, although it's more targeted to immediate problems and social crises. A third element is more the US aid approach. That's economic assistance. And it's not clear to me that economic assistance is in any way coordinated in this regard to thinking about how it's a component of fighting terrorism. Perhaps it is, it's not my area, but that's another possibility. Of course, military intervention plays a role in ethnic conflicts. It's usually used either to kind of force an end to the fighting in a civil war or to implement peacekeeping processes. It has a different kind of meaning in the counterterrorism world, but it is a key component, but it's one of a multi-track approach. And then the final element would be political approaches, political intervention. And here, I think, the lesson from conflict and post-conflict peace building is that you need to think about institution building and state building, right? That where terrorism thrives is typically in weak states with poor institutions, poor representative institutions, or institutions that are monopolized by political, ethnic, and minority groups, and expanding the representation both at the central level and at local levels is a kind of key political challenge. So I would say, you need to take a framework like this and you need to apply this in the field, and that's the way forward. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive answer. Now we can all go home. Thank you.
Great, let's go have a drink.
Okay, our next speaker, Peter Eltsov.
Thank you. So I guess we are facing the most difficult question, what is to be done? It's $1 million question and there is no really answer. If we knew an answer, we probably wouldn't have been here. And probably you've heard quite a few pessimistic talks, and mine will be also quite pessimistic, though I will try to provide some light in the end of the tunnel in the way I can. A few remarks first. I think we are going through a very drastic change of the world, and following the terminology of Carl Schmitt, is the new nomos of the earth. We may see soon major geopolitical changes. You may see the split of Europe. Some European countries, I think, may again realign with Russia. We may see some new alliances in Northern Europe. We may see some also, I would say, we may see some drastic changes happening in Russia. And of course, if Russia falls apart, then that will change the dynamics. What we're having now may seem as a joke in terms of terrorism. Dr. Chin earlier outlined really well two schools of thought, that one who believes that war is helpful in fight of terrorism and some who believe it's not helpful. I belong to the second one. I'm absolutely convinced that war is not going to solve, we're not going to get rid of terrorism through war. This is purely through ideology and economics. And I prefer to put ideology above economics, probably because I grew up in a Marxist state and have a distaste for the rest of my life for the predominance of economics. So I believe in ideology. I'm an ideationalist. And I think the same way an analogy is legitimate with the Cold War. I do believe that the Cold War was won exclusively because it was won ideologically and economically too. But I remember personally really well the morale in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. It's completely changed 100 degrees today, 180 degrees, but it was because of the ideological collapse and corruption that ideology corroded. So this is the only way we can solve, unless the whole world becomes like North Korea, this is the only way we can solve the issue of terrorism. And the claims which were even made here, I think that, for example, Russia solved the issue of terrorism in Chechnya. This is the narrative of the Kremlin today. Yes, I mean, there are very little terror attacks in Dagestan. I spent a lot of time in the Northern Caucasus. Today, there is very little terror attacks in Chechnya, a little bit more in Dagestan because Chechnya way more authoritarian. But it was solved exactly by an example creating a kind of a North Korea, an absolutely authoritarian state, when the leader of the state doesn't even obey the laws of the Russian Federation. He's basically given carte blanche to do whatever he wants. And he has allegiance only to one person, to the president of Russia. And those of you who've read Haji Murat, a short novel by Leo Tolstoy about the Great Caucasian War that took place in the 19th century, not many people realize that it took the Tsars 60 years, half a century to defeat, to get hold of the Northern Caucasus, while the entirety of Southern Caucasus. And at the time there were tons of wars in Europe which were won, and the final solution was exclusively through money and control, and that's exactly what like Russia did today. But what's going to happen that with a change of power and a pyramid of power, it can change any moment. And well, of course, the second argument is there are, according even to official data from the Kremlin, I think Putin said it himself, there are about 7,000, from 7 to 9,000 fighters from the Northern Caucasus in the Islamic State. The Islamic State considers them ironically Russian because they speak Russian, they come from there, and there are like over 200 nationalities in the Northern Caucasus. So the second example would be Uzbekistan, a good example, that you can't establish in an authoritarian state. They also, Karimov, who's recently died, and there's a new president there, they also claim that they got rid of the terror issue. Uzbekistan provides the largest amount of fighters to ISIS from the entirety of Central Asia. So is it really a solution? It's clearly not. So again, coming back to my point, it's ideology and economy. So what we have today after the Cold War, after all this euphoria of the neocons ended, that it was the end of history, and I do actually buy into the thesis of a clash of civilization coming now, and I think that Huntington was right and Fukuyama was fundamentally wrong. And yes, these are social constructs, they can change, we can try to change them, but they're out there. And it's very difficult today to create it's a great noble purpose, but I've spent a lot of time in some really bad places, and I don't believe that in the foreseeable future we will be able to do that. I mean, we can discuss forever whose fault it is, that's a different issue. But what to do about it, that's what our panel is about. So we are in a tremendous ideological vacuum, and an Islamic State, ideology of the Islamic State is filling this vacuum in a way how Communist International was doing in like early 20th century. They actually offer an internationalist idea, at least on paper. They offer, you can be black and be white, you can be a Kazakh, you can be a Turkmen, you can be a blonde German, and if you convert to Islam and accept this ideology, you can be a brother. And there is no competing ideology today in the world. For 70 years we had fascism, liberalism, we had communism. There is no ideology like that today which can compete. And clearly liberalism is in crisis, and two other ideologies, I would say, which can compete today, but which are not as attractive, but which can, nationalism, radical nationalism, clearly the revival of radical nationalism, and a fascination with authoritarianism, which largely comes also very much from Russia and so-called benevolent dictators in the former Soviet Union, like people like, of course, there is a difference between a person like Nazarbayev or Turkmenpashi or Saddam Hussein. So Nazarbayev perceives himself as a benevolent dictator, and there is a lot of mythology around it, or Aliyev, particularly the father, the first president of Azerbaijan. There is this narrative that these people bring peace and stability, and if they're not there, there will be civil war and disaster, and it will be much worse. So to summarize, so we have Islamic liberalism, Islamic State, this pan-Islamic ideology, nationalism, and authoritarianism. What are you going to choose? I mean, does liberalism still stand a chance? Do we have to really even to promote our agenda worldwide? Another frightening trait which goes way along what I would say what we can do and what we should do, like realistically, goes along with nationalism. A radical revision of history, completely ignorant. It goes to pre-Enlightenment time. In Turkmenistan, students have to learn at school that Turkmen people are the oldest on earth and that they've been there forever. Same happening in Ukraine. You couldn't think of that, neither in a Marxist state nor in the 19th century nationalist states. It goes to the Middle Ages. You will ask me, what does it have to do with terrorism? We allow, and I would make a provocative, paradoxical statement, particularly with Western postmodernism, we allow relativism. We allow those ideologies, basically whatever narrative is a narrative. We allow these ideologies, we accept them, we don't stand against these ideologies, we don't express our opinions. We can express, the presidents, I think, of countries should express their opinions on these issues. They should not deal with the president of Tajikistan, who said that Aryanism is an official ideology. You give an inch, they take a foot. So, I will draw a little time, I believe, left. I will draw a very unusual, again, analogy with the Cold War. And I said that ideology is the only way. So it's a very long-term shot. Many of you know of Kennan's long telegram, the famous telegram, 5,000 something words, which he wrote from Moscow to Washington in 1946, I believe. You know, after all the gruesome analysis, when the Russian army was standing in Europe and only three points he made. Know your adversary, be sure of yourself, and improve your own society. And I would say that works so well with our fight with terror. We don't know our adversary well, their identities, their problems, their narratives. We're not sure of yourself. We need to get rid of this narrative that terrorism is an existent trend. And we need to work more on our own issues to be, again, an example like it happened in the Cold War.
Thank you very much. The clash of civilizations is alive and kicking, I guess. And now our next speaker is Sara Del Rey. And please.
Thank you. I'll try not to close the menu. There we go.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on where we came to this work from. For those of you who did not read my bio in excruciating detail, I'm a forensic psychologist, and my actual area of expertise is violence risk assessment. And so what I do on a day-to-day basis, or in my research for over a decade now, has been to take one person in front of me and to decide whether or not I think that person is a danger to others. And my profession has been doing this for 100 years. We came out of the need to identify for the courts who was a danger and who needed to be committed to a hospital setting, who might be ready for parole, and to determine who is no longer a public threat. And so what's been happening in our field of forensic psychology and violence risk assessment specifically is that a lot of us who do this work have been started being asked to consult on terrorism cases. And so we had this sort of inherent interest in looking at, well, are the risk factors that we know to be risk factors for, you know, your day-to-day violence or your general violence, the same ones that we see being the risk factors for terrorism. And so we embarked on this work almost 5 years ago, completely naively saying, well, there must be a good literature out of there. We'll take a look. We'll come up with some conclusions and move forward in our work and our practice. 5 years later, we know that there are, and I'm looking at my students who did most of this work, over 12,000 articles published that had something to do with risk factors for terrorism. And ultimately what we did is we reviewed systematically this work to see what are those empirically evidence-based factors that do indeed predict violence. The short answer is that we don't know. And so we got through this literature and that's a little bleak. We do know some. We ended up realizing that there was really only 50 articles that actually presented any sort of data. The rest of the 200 plus articles that made their way ultimately into our review were thought pieces, and they were conceptual arguments, and they were theoretical papers, and there was very little of what we would normally expect to see in terms of identifying what something is as a risk factor for a violent outcome. I'll tell you what those are that looked to be the ones that are going to hopefully be the way forward. There were 9, and so we found age, socioeconomic status, prior arrest, education, employment, relationship status, and to an earlier point made, having a grievance, and so feeling that there is something political or personal against them or that they felt grieved by on behalf of others. And then a few others in terms of the geography. But that is a best case scenario, even those, because amongst all of those 50 articles that we found, only 6 actually did the statistical analyses that we would be comfortable saying that that thing is actually a risk factor. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the work, there are several conditions that must be in place statistically for something to be identified as a risk factor. And now the first thing that you have to have is that there is a statistical association. And so where the vast majority, the 200 almost articles fell apart, was that they didn't conduct any sort of statistical analyses in the inferential sense. They were presenting descriptive statistics, so prevalence, frequency, and all within terror risks. So the second important piece is that if we don't compare them to somebody who isn't engaging in terrorist activity, we don't know that that factor actually distinguishes between a terrorist and non-terrorist. And so that was the very bleak answer that we came to. And there were really only 3 or 4 risk factors that we had any confidence because there were these kinds of studies being done. So in terms of, thinking how we move forward, well, I have 3 very simple things that we need to do. The first thing is that we need to do better research. And this is really what I've been doing on podiums and at conferences and at these kinds of meetings and for the last 6 months, and making a whole lot of friends saying that we need to do better research, that we need to be using the scientific method and be conducting the research that we know is necessary to actually identify what distinguishes between a terrorist and a non-terrorist. And I'm going to give you the spoiler that being Muslim was not one of those. So the next thing that I'm going to say that we need to do is that we then have to have better policy. And what I mean by that is that the policy that we have, I'm not saying that our current counterterrorism strategies are necessarily ineffective, but we don't know that they're effective or that they have an evidence base. And so one of my real big pet peeves is when we're talking about policy in relation to terrorist activity, don't assert that it's evidence-based, because I know for a fact that that evidence just simply isn't there. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be ineffective, but we also don't know that it is going to be effective. The thing that makes me even more concerned is that, and I'm sorry I missed the previous panels, I was quite literally on a plane from Boston, but one of the things that really is detrimental to this in-group, out-group idea is some of the factors that we're talking about. So some of the factors and the policies that are in place and might be very well intentioned are actually creating conditions in which individuals are feeling more aggrieved, more persecuted, and thus feeling justified to be engaging in terrorist activity against the United States. And so my last very simple recommendation is that we then must come up with better interventions when we do identify individuals who are at risk of terrorism. And that, I quite frankly have no idea what that is, but that's where we need to be going. And so the analog to violence risk assessment when we're doing that work is that once we figure out for an individual person what the reason is that they're engaging in violent behavior, we do intervention around what that reason was, and that is going to be a very idiosyncratic process. And I'm going to give you a really classic example from the violence risk assessment world. Well, I'm going to give you two, actually. So the first one is drugs. So I will be the first to tell you that drug abuse and misuse of drugs is a very robust population risk factor for violent behavior. But that doesn't mean that using drugs is actually related to violence for that one person sitting in front of you. So you actually have to have an understanding of whether or not drugs are implicit in their activity, or in their violent activity specifically. And so that's a really important distinction, because if you're treating somebody's drug abuse problem and saying, why are they still being violent, it might very well be not that the treatment doesn't work, but that their drug use has no relationship with their violence. And so in the same way, if we're asserting that people have grievances, or if we're saying that the reason this person is engaging in terrorist activity is because they're unemployed and feeling persecuted, we actually need to determine that to know whether or not an intervention that is economically based is going to actually help in this situation. And so that's the first example was drug abuse. The second example, and I understand it was brought up earlier, and so I'm going to get on my pedestal or my soapbox for a moment, is mental illness. So the vast majority of my research, if you look me up, is all about mental illness and violence. And there is an association there. It is modest in size, but it is significant. We do not see that association yet in terrorism. And anecdotally, what I've seen in the research, and this is not statistical, but this is just based on all of this work that we've done, is that it looks like there is potentially a role for mental illness in the lone wolf, so that domestic terrorist threat in which somebody is spending a lot of time on the internet, isolated, has some sort of grievance, attitudes towards a group. But what is completely counter to the idea of mental illness being involved in terrorism more broadly is that those individuals who have serious mental illnesses don't engage in groups. And so if you're now saying that, well, they must be crazy because they're engaging in these activities, they're part of this group, they're part of ISIS, they're part of whatever, that is not what we mean when we talk about mental illness clinically. What we're talking now when we're saying, oh, that person must have been crazy to get involved in this, is a lack of understanding on our part of what the reasons and motives are, and an inability to really get how somebody who might otherwise seem quote-unquote normal would be doing these things. And that isn't mental illness. And so I think those are two important distinctions, and that's what I mean by better intervention. So focusing on those factors that actually are relevant to radicalization and terrorism threat when it's identified.
Thank you very much indeed. Dick Kohn.
Thanks, Klaus, and thanks for organizing this conference. It's really fascinating. I'm going to start my timer here.
I'll remind you, no worries.
Well, I gave myself an extra couple of minutes. Bob talked about framing this, and Farah talked about the importance of lexicon. So I'm going to do something kind of different from most of what you've heard in the last 2 days. And that is to ask you to think about the word war. What does war mean? Because I'm convinced that if we abandon the war trope or meme or frame for dealing with terrorism, we will be a lot better off, and we will be able to solve many of the problems that have been raised by the panelists. Much of what they say is accurate, important, helpful, but as long as the political leadership in the United States thinks of this as war, we are not going to get very far. So what I'm going to give you is partly a military analysis, because what war does is to militarize the problem of dealing with terrorism. And that has been the great, enormous flaw of the United States' approach since 9/11. And I think the Europeans have done much better on that subject. So the first thing you want to do is to ask, what are the goals of the two sides? What are our goals? What are their goals? Their goals range from the realistic to the apocalyptic. There are all sorts of goals. What unites them is the tactics and the strategy that they are pursuing, which is of violence, and violence that gets widespread publicity and widespread understanding, and frightens and causes reactions from our side. Our side is the protection of the population, the maintenance of basic values, liberty, freedom, democracy, capitalism, the interests overseas of the various countries involved, basically economic, but often political, and in our case, often military. And we require the freedom of the common spaces, which are the seas, space, and cyberspace. And I'll say more about cyber in a little bit. The great philosopher or theorist of war of the early 19th century was Karl von Clausewitz. And he said the first thing that people thinking about war have to do is to try to determine what kind of a war are they in. War comes in an enormous range of possibilities and characteristics. Terrorism has been with us from the beginning of organized warfare. I could name the wars. The United States practiced it beautifully in the War for Independence, not against the British, but against British adherents, other Americans. It was practiced in the Civil War, it was practiced in the Cold War by both sides, it was practiced in the World Wars, it was practiced in the Peloponnesian War. It is not the definition of war. It's a tactic and a strategy. You can't make war against terrorism. You make war against terrorists, their networks, their organizations. And you might make war against their goals. You might attack them. So you may think in war terms, but that's really not much of an answer. So we change our thinking, okay? As Lincoln said in the middle of the Civil War, as our situation is new, we must think anew. So why is it not war? First of all, in order for it to be war, you have to tell me how it ends. You have to tell me when it ends. You have to tell me what win means. You have to tell me what victory means. You know, it's really much more like, as the old analogy goes, whack-a-mole. You can't answer those questions, the timetable, and yet in the understanding of the public and in the understanding of the political leadership, war invokes the need for those kinds of answers which can't be given. So I think it's really important to do this. Now, does that mean there are other aspects of war which might be necessary to apply to this problem? One of them is the use of force. Yes, you might need to use military force to deny a sanctuary, to overthrow a terroristic regime, to hunt down and kill terrorists. But you have to, if you're going to kill terrorists, and I don't believe you can kill your way out of this problem, if you're going to kill terrorists, make sure that the ones you kill and the way you do it doesn't create more terrorists, which is what we have been doing. One of the things you have to do in wartime is to make sure that your internal policies don't undermine your own goals for the war. We've been pretty bad at that, preserving civil liberties, preserving freedoms, preserving our resilience, preserving our patience, and those kinds of things have to be seen to. We need to force unity in the population. That's what we do in war. It helps to support whatever policies you're trying to pursue, whatever military action you're trying to pursue. You want to get the cooperation of your population. You want to get the cooperation and the aid and support of your allies, because terrorism is a transnational phenomenon, but you don't want to subordinate your foreign policy completely or even largely to terrorism. This isn't World War II. This is not an existential threat to the United States or to the West or to democracies, unless we so misplay our hand that our reactions then allow us to change our values, to change our behaviors, to change our institutions in such a ways that the terrorists succeed. So I think we do need to think to some degree in wartime terms. What is more important, offense or defense? Well, you have to defend the country. You have to defend the borders, but you don't overemphasize that. You don't make the Coast Guard and the FBI into anti-terror organizations exclusively or even largely. The FBI is a law enforcement organization. The Coast Guard has many functions besides keeping terrorists out. For one thing, it's supposed to deal with drugs and other kinds of things. You have to attack the problem of the internet and cyber. That's been clear from this conference. So let's think about how you would do that if this was really a very difficult war. I think you would go to the social media companies and you would say, the game is up, the party is over. You are going to have to cooperate with the government. And if you don't cooperate with us, we'll pass laws. And you know what Congress is like. You won't like those laws. You have to go to the internet companies too, and the infrastructure of the internet companies, and you have to say, you have to cooperate with us, with the government, because we have a problem with terrorism. And in wartime, what do we do with companies and phenomenon and infrastructure that is either dysfunctional or doesn't cooperate? We take them over. Do you want us to take you over, or are you willing to cooperate with us? So those kinds of things have to be undertaken. I mean, if it's really that bad a threat, let's do something about it. I could go on and on about defense, because when I served on the U.S. Commission on National Security 21st Century, and we heard a Coast Guard commander tell us that you could put a nuclear weapon into a container that is uninspected, and it lands in Long Beach, California, and it gets transferred without inspection to a train, and then it ends up in the railroad yards in the middle of Chicago. I'm from Chicago. And when they find out from the GPS where it is, they touch it off, and there goes Chicago. I mean, James Schlesinger, who was not an easy man to scare, was blown away by that thought, and the rest of us were also. You have to know who you're going after. You have to know the cultures. You have to use sometimes military force. You have to use indigenous governments. But you don't need to have that drive your relationships with the outside world, or the terrorists will really have won. The real issue, as we've said in this conference, is a political strategy. Using war as a disruption or a paradigm will lead us astray. We have dealt with terrorism in the past. It's been a part of other kinds of wars. And we can deal with it again. Let me end with a warning. And the warning return to my comments about cyber. Cyber is old from the standpoint of electronic warfare. It is very new in the way it has invaded and become ubiquitous in modern society. And the danger is that it's cheap. You don't have to have a large industrial operation to be good at cyber. You need a lot of people who are skilled in it. You need some machines. And most of all, you need a weak and vulnerable target. like American banks, like the entire infrastructure system of our electric system, our dams, like countries that won't bring its social media and cyber companies to heel. You can't separate it out from other kinds of warfare or activity in conflict. And the reason is it's kind of like gunpowder. Think about gunpowder or explosives' role in war. Cyber has become that. We also need to do other things. You know, if you're really concerned about national security, we ought to have effective gun regulation in this society. It's not impossible. It's a national security problem. Isn't the first job of political leaders to protect the population that elected them and that they serve? So that's important. We are vulnerable. Our organization for cyber is pathetic. It's been pathetic for at least 20 years. We have given over the protection of society to the Homeland Security Department. Who do you think the president wants when there's a real massive cyber attack on the United States, sitting on his or her right, and perhaps on the left, and perhaps behind him too? Do you think it's the Department of Homeland Security, or is it the NSA? Where is the capability in this country? Last I looked, the NSA was part of the Department of Defense. Isn't this part of defending the United States? So there's a lot of internal change that has to be done in this country. There are a lot of policies that need to be preserved, as many people have said in this conference. But the truth of the matter is that we are a resilient society if we have halfway smart leadership and we think things through for ourselves. We've been dealing with all sorts of threats in this country, including a threat to the Union in the middle of the 19th century, which involved a lot of terrorism. So I think we can do that, but we have to get some common sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These were clear words, and I'm sure we will find these smart leaders at some stage. Before I open it up to the public, I think I would like to go back to probably the fundamental question which has occupied us throughout the conference, but we haven't really addressed it because it's so difficult to address. You know, let's go back to the causes of terrorism. What are the causes? There's often in the media the idea if we resolve the Israel-Palestine problem, then peace will break out. Or if the United States and Western foreign policy became very different, more peaceful, less, let's say, put it, meddling in other countries' affairs, suddenly we would have, you know, this terrorism would just fade away. What do the panelists think?
I don't think we're part of the problem, a small part of the problem, but I don't think that we need to turn our entire international behavior upside down, which is what you just suggested, in order to deal with it, because I don't think it would work. Because I don't think the source of terrorism, is Western policy. It's involved. What are the sources of terrorism? I'm not a terrorism expert. These are groups, as far as I can read, that have specific goals, often in a country. They've merged those goals with the belief that if they expel the West, both culturally, politically, economically, and militarily from their countries, they might succeed. They have some of them have apocalyptic religious views. Others of them have merged with criminal gangs in some of these countries. I think you could get yourself a whole list of them, of these goals, and I think you would have to apply them here, apply them there, don't apply them here, don't apply them there. You know, a list like that is not going to solve the problem either. Okay. There's specifics.
Okay, thanks.
That's enough, right?
I feel a lot of pressure as a psychologist to come up with a cause of human behavior.
That would be nice.
Yeah, and my answer is going to be completely dissatisfying. I think that it can't be one cause, and I think that human behavior is so complex that for me, I view terrorism as a specific form of violence that has sort of risen to the top in terms of prevalence and an opportunity, and also a level of acceptance. But we've had violence in society for as long as we've had society, and it's often about resources, it's often about attitudes, it's often about arguments and misunderstandings between groups. And so, not to sound completely pessimistic, I don't think that we're going to get rid of terrorism. I think terrorism is one of the current and fashionable or acceptable forms of violence that we have. And if we think about terrorism as one category of violence, and then we looked at things like gang violence or gun violence, we have actually a lot more of those other things. But terrorism is such a specific, targeted, and sort of often politically motivated, or some sort of message that's trying to be passed along, that it's receiving a lot more attention. And so I think the causes are complex.
That's a good answer.
Sorry. So I think even if we accept that kind of narrative that, okay, it's our fault, let's change our behavior.
Is it?
I'm saying, you said that, you suggested that. Like I'm saying,
I asked.
Oh, okay, but I'm saying if we accept that kind of like explanation hypothetically and say, okay, let's change our behavior, let's withdraw from the Middle East, let's help to create a Palestinian state. I mean, the first thing I would say, it's too late. There is a whole legacy of contention. I mean, it's completely unrealistic and impossible. It's like completely recreating the whole world. And by the way, like that's what some other countries trying to do. Exactly, that's what Russia's trying to do in the Middle East. That's what China is probably trying to do also with its economic expansionism, to change the map of the world. So I don't think it would change anything. And I do think that causes of terrorism are definitely multiple and complex, as everyone said. But I do think that particular, I agree that we shouldn't use the term war on terror, because it's really poorly defined. But I do think in that particular instance since 9/11, there is, of course, terrorism has existed forever, but there is some unique element to this terrorism, and it does have to do, we are in denial to say that it doesn't have anything to do with culture difference, with the West versus East. It does have to do with Islam, and we just have to face it. And that's it. Okay.
Well, like Dick, I'm not an expert on terrorism, but like everyone else, I'll give a response. Because that's what's expected of being in this seat. I agree with Sarah. Terrorism is a particular kind of violence. It's politically motivated. I think that's what the essence of terrorism is. And as Dick noted in his wonderful comments, it's been a long tactic in warfare. So from that standpoint, we're not going to get rid of it. It's going to reemerge in different forms. I would disagree with the narrow definition that Peter just gave. I think it's a belief structure for sure, but there's no reason to associate it with Muslims or civilization or anything else, because political violence takes lots of forms, and it's usually built around a kind of notion that you can utilize violence to achieve goals that you can't otherwise use traditional political methods for. I mean, that's kind of a Clausewitzian perspective, I guess. And what I would say in that regard is what a lot of the literature shows, at least the kind of socio-political literature, is that you need people to perpetrate that kind of violence. And that's a lot of what we've ended up talking about in the last day, is who are the carriers of terrorism. But that's only part of the story. There's a whole contextual situation that produces those carriers.
I just wanted very briefly to clarify that I did not mean to say that it's exclusively Muslim or associated with Islam. Clearly, I absolutely agree there was terrorism historically. There was terrorism during the American Revolution, Russian Revolution. There was, for God's sake, in the 19th century, the whole age of terrorism was in Russia and everywhere. But in this specific period, in the context that we're talking, I think that we need to accept it and take it into consideration, that that's an important element. Of course, there was a Japanese terrorism, I mean, that throughout history, but I do think that we're denying certain things today.
Can I just wrap that?
Yeah.
But you know, that's a definitional issue, right? Because, I mean, we've heard this already today, and Dick mentioned this, you know, gun violence is a tremendous problem in the United States, and we don't define that as terrorism, right? So there's a whole industry, David and I were talking about this last night, there's a whole industry that's developed since 9/11 about terrorism. I mean, that's another reason why terrorism's not going to go away. I mean, what would that industry do if we stopped terrorism, right? It has to find new terrorists. Practically, the great day will come when they move that toward lone wolf gun violence. But until that day, you know, we're stuck with these narrow definitions that tend to play into a bigger political narrative, I think.
I think it has to do with causes.
Well, at least I got you all going, I think. I think that's something. And I think, you know, I agree, of course, with Dick that we can't, you know, look at our world and turn everything upside down. But on the other hand, you know, if there's such a violent reaction to us, then we can't do everything right either. So we need to respond in some thoughtful way. And I think I would like to ask you now to ask thoughtful questions. So who would like to go and ask the first thoughtful or provocative question? Yes, please.
So many panelists talked about the limitations of military force or not entirely relying on military force. So I want to ask what version of military force from your perspective is beneficial or something that actually has positive effects?
Do you want to address it to someone
I
particularly?
think both professors on the end talked about it specifically.
Okay, let's start with
it.
All right.
Well, military force is a very blunt instrument, and when it doesn't produce quick results, there's a desire to have more of it. And the more you have of it, the more death and destruction you produce. And so the military force you have to use has to be very targeted. We are now in the United States focusing on drone strikes and on special forces operating in the shadows in countries that will permit us to operate. But there are terrorists and folks that need to be either taken out or neutralized or captured or put into the legal system in countries and in places that are ungoverned and where we are not permitted to operate. But to respond then to military by using military force would in my judgment, be counterproductive. Because as I said at one point, when you use force and you use killing, you have to make sure that you're not creating more terrorists than you're eliminating or neutralizing or incarcerating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my response would be that it's highly situational, so it's hard to come up with a policy statement that covers all instances, but in general, you'd use military force to secure territory. That's what military force is good at. So if your terrorism, like ISIS, for example, is creating a territorial issue that you feel you need to solve, that's when you use military force. Otherwise, you're looking for different kinds of solutions. Now, police forcing, which can either be at the local or even the individual level, borders on military force, but it's not. The commitment and one of the things that the intervention literature has looked at is the concept of footprint. The bigger your footprint, the harder it is to extract yourself from the environment. So you want to basically start with small footprint and then as you need move larger, and I think the U.S. response typically is to go in with a big footprint for a lot of reasons, but the one that's always given is to protect casualties, and whether that's the right strategy or not seems to be problematic.
I also want to add one point. Just to add one quick point to this is that the use of the military can be accountable. That is, I'm not in favor of using force without the military. That is, if you turn the drone or allow the CIA to engage in drone strikes, what you're doing is secret, untransparent, targeted assassination. And that's really not permissible under our laws or under our cultural values. So the use of the military can be held accountable. They operate under law. They're highly trained. This is not to say that they don't create collateral damage and collateral casualties, but it's a better way to use some of these tactics that we're trying to use now.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please. Warren.
To take you back to the sort of basic fundamentals and the definitional problem, Richard actually talked about this idea of war. What is war? Well, essentially war is the use of violence to achieve a political object. What is terrorism? Terrorism is about the use of violence to achieve a political object. Osama bin Laden made a comparison. He actually said the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, killing tens of thousands of people. Actually, how was that any different to what he did with regard to 9/11? Except the scale in 9/11 was actually smaller. So, a question that needs to be asked is this. We categorise and we construct this idea that terrorism is something unique and different. Actually, maybe we need to start recognising that terrorism isn't unique, it isn't different. We've just created this construct largely to delegitimise violence prosecuted by particular groups. So I really wanted to actually hear the panel's view on Osama bin Laden's observation and his comparison about violence and types of violence and how that makes them actually reflect on the concept of terrorism.
So basically what you're saying, state violence is okay, but...
No. I'm not saying that at all.
Okay.
I'm actually saying that if violence is the use, if you're using force to achieve a political objective, whether it's conducted by a political actor or a non-state actor, why does it matter? Surely the problem here is that groups embark upon the use of violence, which implies rational purpose. So that explains the cause of terrorism itself. It becomes a logical choice. If I'm Ayman Zawahiri living in Egypt in the 1970s and I'm making a decision about how am I going to overthrow this corrupt regime run by Sadat, my choices are limited because actually I can't do guerrilla warfare because I live in a country that's largely desert. All I have are people living in major population centres. These are my principal centres of gravity. The only thing I can then do to attack Sadat is to conduct terrorism. So what I'm saying is that terrorism in some ways is a rational act, an act designed to achieve a particular effect, an exercise of power. The only difference is that it is largely conducted by non-state actors, and states choose to define it in a certain way. That's my view, and the fact that we see the emergence of a literature which talks about violent non-state actors rather than terrorists or insurgents, in some way suggests that there are a lot of people out there who find the whole idea of terrorism unsatisfactory and not useful as a way for investigating the deeper problems about how these groups operate and why they do what they do. So I just want to throw that open to the panel to actually go back to that question of what you think terrorism is. And do you think that maybe Osama bin Laden has a point?
Thank you.
I'm not going to speak to that idea of state actors, but I wanted to, this is a perfect opportunity to bring up an observation that I didn't bring up earlier, is that one of the central assumptions in the field, and the whole reason why we thought we should revisit the entire literature, is that there was something really unique about terrorism compared to every other type of violence. And there's been a lot written about how, well, the risk factors must be different, we can't take the same instruments we use for any other form of violence. And ultimately what we found is that the risk factors actually mapped on pretty clearly to what we call the central 8 risk factors for criminal behavior and violence. There was really almost nothing that really distinguished it. And your point about the purpose of violence, when there is rational thought, so I would argue that sometimes there isn't rational thought or a motive specific in that way, but it is about power and control often, or an expression of anger. And that's true of whether it's power and control over a spouse, over a group in gang violence, or as you say, over an entire organization or state. And so I think your point is well taken, that actually when we're using violence towards some means, the motivation and the risk factors are actually all the same.
Terrorism is a form of warfare. It's always been a form employed by the weak. Osama bin Laden made those comments hiding in a cave in the Hindu Kush. That tells you something. Yes, you can frame it the way you framed it. It's political violence, or it's violence employed for a political goal. But most war, all war is, if you accept Clausewitz, but it comes in a variety of forms, tactics, strategies, operational art. And terrorism is among the weakest forms of warfare there is.
Anyone else?
Yes, I agree to a large degree with what you've said, but that brings to mind another term is legitimacy. Legitimacy of this state structure since the Westphalian system. Yeah, the states are allowed to do what non-state actors are not allowed to do, and that's pretty much a difference. And the second, I agree with Sara that violence for political purposes, yes, it's violence for political purposes, but very often depends on the definition of your political purposes. I'm sure if the Chechens did what they did and eventually they achieved independence, yes, probably those guys who did those attacks, the Moscow theater siege and so on, they would be considered as heroes later in Chechnya if Chechnya became an independent state. But a lot of terrorist violence, what we call terrorist violence, of course it's a very poorly defined concept, is not done for clear political purposes. There's no very clear political agenda. It's just done on the basis of like I think grievances without a pure goal.
Warren, do you want a response there?
I agree to a point, and I think if we look at the sampling of terrorist groups, so if we looked at I Am Sharikyo, can anyone for the love of God tell me what that man was actually thinking in terms of what he was doing? It's not clear to me. So in that sense, that challenges the notion, or reinforces the notion, sorry, that terrorism is something different. But actually, when you look at the broad ranging of terrorist groups across history, and I accept that it is a strategy of the weak, but that in itself implies rationality. And what that suggests is that actually the Clausewitzian universe that you referred to, Richard, should also apply to terrorist groups. And if we accept that basic assumption that terrorist violence is actually no different from other forms of political violence articulated by other groups, whether they're states, kingdoms, or whatever else, then ultimately that simplifies the question of why do terrorists do what they do? They do what they do because they are wishing to achieve a particular object.
But all terrorists are not rational, nor are they necessarily assigned on to the political goals. If you're going to accept some scrap of paper left in a vehicle, I was doing it to support ISIS. How do we know? I mean, we have to employ Sarah's discipline to really know what's going on in these person's mind.
I simply throw it out there as a because we haven't contested or challenged that sort of perception of what terrorism is. I'm not suggesting that they're right, but maybe we should.
Terrorism can be rational, but not all terrorists are rational.
Well, one could say the same thing about certain state leaders, couldn't they?
Or soldiers being drafted into a mass army.
Yeah, yeah.
Klaus, I think there's an important distinction here to be made, and I'm going to put my lawyer hat on and say that, and this is built on what Peter was saying, is that states have legitimacy to use force when they do so in accordance with law. And you can make a distinction between states where there has a leader that drops barrel bombs on hospitals on its own people and is acting in a terrorist manner, I believe, against its own people, but that's outside the laws of war, and therefore that's why that's totally illegitimate and just as bad as when al-Qaeda does it. But you do have states that act in accordance with the law of war, either under the law of self-defense, or they have a treaty justification under the UN Charter to use force. And that is why it's so important that when we do use military force, that we better have a darn good legal reason, and why it was so dangerous to make the argument that when the United States was going to use force, oh, we can do it not in accordance with the law of war because this is a different kind of war. That doesn't cut it. So those are the distinctions I would make, and how to explain that the dichotomy that you
but how
laid
would
out.
you view dropping the atomic bomb on a Japanese city? Is that according to the laws of war, or isn't it? Yeah. It's not as easily defined as it sounds.
Well, pardon? You think it? What do you think, Dick?
At the time it
Well,
was.
civilians were never allowed to be a
Less
target.
civilians were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki than were killed in the March 9/10 fire raid on Tokyo with conventional weapons.
Yeah, no, I don't think it matters whether it was conventional or nuclear, but attacking civilians, I don't think has ever
don't
been
see how you
allowed.
can
in
argue
other
that
than-
Hiroshima, most of those cities had been evacuated, Klaus, of civilians. Hiroshima was the site of the headquarters for countering the invasion of Japan on that island, which was planned for November 1. They knew where we were going to.
Nagasaki didn't.
Well, and we didn't have to.
Yes, please.
All right, when we talk about terrorist incidents, and particularly state-sponsored ones, I think we're referring to individuals in support of a certain ethos of the state, whether it's ISIS or somebody else, and excluding the U.S. Gun violence, mental health associated or not. This panel is trying to help us figure out how to respond. Where do you categorize what's happened in Myanmar? Was that state-sponsored terror, using a military to create a terroristic situation which eliminated 600,000 residents? Does this model go back to Kosovo, ethnic conflict? Where did the United Nations and the rest of the world, what grade would you give them in their response to that?
That's a question for Bob.
Well, I guess, you know, it's a professional hazard, but I would say all of this is political, right? I mean, some of it's geopolitical, some of it's domestic political, and so the absolute standards are there, right? I mean, as David pointed out, there is a legal framework about when states can use violence against other states. And the interpretation of that is left to the United Nations Security Council, which is a political body. It's not left to a court, it's not based on jurisprudence, it's not based on common law or any kind of past thing. So ultimately, these are all political decisions. The decision of the United Nations to intervene in any particular case and the way it intervenes is a political decision. The decision of member states to respond to incidents independent of the United Nations is a political decision. We did that in Iraq, clearly. So in the end, you have to ask fundamental questions about the way politics is organized, worldwide, geopolitically, as well as within countries. And I don't think that, you know, we can make some kind of grand scheme, except that, you know, it's a guide. You want to understand, as I said in answer to the young lady before, it's situational, you know. My framework is, let's look at the politics, but the politics can vary widely. So that's about as clear an answer as I can give you. But I can't give you a kind of eternal answer that would help us understand all these situations.
I agree. I don't have much to add. I think it's totally situational and geopolitical, and from the kind of like political realism, it just depends on the power of the nation states. I mean, what Stalin did in the Soviet Union with the resettlements of people, of course, can count as like, I mean, even Hitler never done anything like that to the scale. Can be seen as a state terrorism. So, I mean, it's situational, definitely. And
yeah, I would just go on and say, you know, it depends also on the goals, right? So if your goals are to create some kind of international system, then if you want to create, you know, a broad-based and internationally legitimate system, then you're going to try to get buy-in from the most number of actors. I mean, look at the first Gulf War versus the Iraq War. Big difference in international political legitimacy there, right? Now, of course, we can push that and say the Soviet Union was weak at the time, Gorbachev needed the West. I mean, there was also domestic political motivations for him to change what had previously been Cold War obstinance toward cooperation with the West. So, you know, it's hard, you know, I don't want to end up in a historicist argument, but it's hard not to see these things as very historically contingent.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, there. And yes, please.
Yes, I have two questions.
Yep.
On Professor Kohn's criticisms of the...
Can you speak up a little?
Yes, sorry. On Professor Kohn's criticisms of the U.S. government not, or just governments in general, not acting enough in regard to social media and internet and like making sure that they are trying to prevent terrorism. And I was just curious, first off, like I had a question on the, just if this is a little bit presumptuous regarding maybe the government's ability to better prevent this than social media companies or something, political will aside. And also my second question is, also I guess making a law would be a good statement, but also if this statement is more positive or negative, and the extent to which it's fair to say that government's slow action on issues of cybersecurity is a government problem rather than given just civic discontent with any sort of regulation on the cybersphere.
Well, I'll try to be brief. First of all, I don't believe that corporations are people, because I've never seen a corporation jailed, although it probably would be appropriate in some cases. I think that what I was trying to say in very brief terms was that governments can and have, and I believe should, act for the public's safety. And they have to do it in such a way as not to invade the constitutional guarantees that people have. For example, the Fourth Amendment against search and seizure and privacy. The Second Amendment, even misinterpreted by the Supreme Court, has the force of law. So what's done in the case of a threat to the public safety of this magnitude are laws that can be put in place that are temporary as long as necessary. You can impose costs on corporations to behave in certain ways in order to use the public space and to be able to do business in the country. And I think right now, at least as I read the public prints, these social media companies and internet companies are so powerful and so large, and the population is so worried about government intervention that the Congress seems paralyzed in what to do about it. But Congress is paralyzed in the whole cyber area anyway, and in many other areas having to do with military and national security.
Yeah, but when it comes to tax, they suddenly get moving.
Well, that's spending. That's spending.
Right, any more questions, please? Yes, please.
Well, I think when you consider the desire of the people committing terrorist acts, so say they're willing to give up their entire rest of their life to either be killed or go to jail, consider as compared to like people fighting for, say, the West or the Americans, a soldier would say, well, I'm not really willing to go to jail for the rest of my life for democracy or to be killed like in a foreign battle. Like, how do you think that affects the policy going forward, given that they're willing, the people, like terrorists are willing to give up everything where people fighting against them may not be willing to do the same?
Thank you. That seems to be a question for you.
Oh, gosh. Alrighty then. So, I don't know that I have an answer of where that places us on policy. I think it speaks to a level of desperation and a feeling of that this act of terrorism or this involvement in terrorism would be the only option. And I think that's where we see perhaps some distinction with terrorism. Although, individuals who are acting violence often also think of it as the only option. And I think that might be what's going on, because those who are choosing to fight against terrorism or to go to war and join our military and fight overseas, but perhaps not die, they have the option to not. And I think on the other side, if we're looking at the conditions in which people are living, it really might be that this is not actually the worst option.
A million Americans join the military and accept the risk of death. I don't know that we have 1 million terrorists who have joined terrorist groups willing to accept death. It might be the case. But I think we tend to confuse terrorists with that small group of people who are suicide bombers. Those we don't have in the American Armed Forces, although there are some instances historically in which members of armed forces have accepted that risk and accepted suicide missions.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please.
I guess this would really go for anyone who'd like to answer. In terms of generating a response at really any level, international, national, or even subnational, do you see any issues in just the fundamental way that national security structures are designed, just because they're not historically built to handle terrorist issues? Be it the U.S. National Security Council, the UN Security Council, is there just a fundamental disconnect between the institutions we have and their actual modus operandi, and then the issues that they're being pushed to by the public, especially to become involved in?
Thank you. Yeah.
I think there is no way to design those policies or institutions, particularly for a liberal society. That's why we are so easily targeted, because as I said when I had my 10 minutes, unless we become a North Korea, we can't design those policies. It's just impossible. It's a question of ideology. We can fight each other ideologically, but we can protect ourselves.
Yep.
I guess I would just say that it depends a lot on what you're referring to as terrorism, right? I mean, if you're referring to a tactic, it's very difficult to think about how you define an organizational strategy to respond to a tactic in all situations. I think that doesn't make any sense. And most of our institutions, whether they're global or national, are set up to respond to specific threats, right? So that's what you have to look at, is the specific threats, not kind of a broad strategy in that regard. And I think that's true even at the local level. If you look at police, right? Police might have strategies to deal with things, but they respond to local threats all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer an anecdote. I do think there is unnecessary siloing and a lack of information flow. And that's true of any organization or any jurisdiction. But I'm going to give you a good example. So I didn't mention that our work is being funded by a research arm of the NSA. And so at NC State University, we have the Laboratory for Analytic Science, which is funded out of the NSA. And I got a phone call recently to participate in an expert interview on a project being funded by Homeland Security, looking for whether or not existing violence risk assessment tools were relevant to the application towards terrorism. And it was essentially the work that we've been doing for 5 years. And so I think there is, just as a classic example, of a lack of information flow across agencies because of the way that they're legislated and that they've been organized.
I hope you took the money.
Oh, I sure did.
Thank you. Yes, Maureen, yes, please.
To flag one study that's already been done on this, which is Jim Locker did the project on national security reform over a period of years in the 2000s, where he actually recommended revamping how the national security organizations, how the government is formed, to look at horizontally managing across issues rather than, a DOD and a state, and thinking of things in terms of the tools and think of them more in terms of the issues. So it wasn't specific to terrorism, although they did a deep dive on NCTC as a model of horizontal integration on an issue. So I would just recommend you look up Project on National Security, National Security Reform, PNSR, Project on National Security Reform, and you'll find some interesting information there.
Right, thank you very much. We have time for a few more questions, but not many. Who would like to ask one of the last two questions? Special offer here. Then I think we have exhausted everyone. Maybe before we finish, I give a chance to everyone on our panel to say a few concluding words, starting with Kohn.
I think I've talked enough this evening, so let me pass it to Sara.
I did have one thing that I was thinking about as we've been talking about what is this definition of terrorism and assumptions of rationality. And in the violence world, we've realized that assumptions of rationality are just frankly false. And that we're often trying to rationalize for our own sakes, not to help us solve this issue for why somebody might do one thing. And so we've found it useful in our field to distinguish between two types of violence. And I just was wondering here, and I've got my students sitting over here, I'm like, this would be a great dissertation. But thinking about violence, we talk about reactive versus proactive violence. And so am I engaging in violence because you've done something to me? So I'm reacting. Or am I engaging in violence because it's instrumental and I'm thinking about what that end goal is that I want? And I feel like we've always assumed that terrorism is instrumental, but I actually think what we've seen in our work anyway is that there's a lot of evidence that it's both reactive and instrumental, depending on the actor and the organization and circumstances. And that might just be a useful way to think and move forward, and hopefully not assume or presume that terrorism is for some rational goal.
Thank you.
Just one brief comment. I was also thinking about your comment and comparison between Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what's the definition of terrorism. I mean, of course, there is a lot of gray zone, and as I said, it has to do with state actors versus non-state actors. But there are clear cases, I would say, of completely, I would define as a useless, meaningless, and reckless violence for unclear political purposes, like, for example, the Beslan terror attack, which not many people realize that was the Chechens did. It wasn't even against ethnic Russians. It was against the Ingush, which is another Caucasian nationality, and it was exclusively against children. And a similar thing happened in the northwest frontier of Pakistan. So that kind of violence, I think, I mean, is clearly different, I mean, from the war type violence in case of World War II.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Like Dick, I think I've probably talked enough. So my comments would be thank everyone for coming and your great attention.
Before you all go, I would like to, point out Toby Hoff here in the background, who should be right at the front, because he did most of the work and he was instrumental in getting this conference together. And I would like to thank all of the remaining panelists and also the ones who are in the audience, and of course you, the audience, for staying with us so long and for asking so many interesting questions. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for making this such a successful event, at least in my view, hope in your view as well. And perhaps, sometime in the future we'll do something similar. Who knows? Thank you very much indeed.